when Jock Lewis was killed in December 1941, he was really lost, and he turned the SAS into, he recruited the likes of Fitzroy Maclean and Randolph Churchill, who really weren't suited to this sort of warfare. And for the first 6 months of 1942, as Guy Prendergast, the CEO of the LRDG, described it, it was like something out of Gilbert and Sullivan. Some of these very daring raids, but useless.
Okay, so my take on this is that David Stirling, what he's really, really good at, and I'm going to go on using this, he iterates, right? So after the first operation, he iterates. Him and Jock Lewis have that discussion to use the LRDG. And the reason they use the LRDG is because he's got drunk at Shepherds with Prendergast. Now, the LRDG and the SAS fall out later on because basically L Detachment SAS is hopelessly disorganized. Now, we can talk about that. I think the tragedy is that what Stirling was good at was filling his capability gaps. From founding the unit, he knew he was a disorganized guy, right? But there are lots of disorganized guys. I mean, famously, Richard Branson didn't know the difference between net and gross profit when he was running Virgin Airlines aged 50.
Hello and welcome to the pod, Yuletide style, as I have a debate between two SAS historians thrashing it out as to David Stirling's role in the founding and establishment of the SAS in World War II. Gavin Mortimer has written an acclaimed history, The Phoney Major, and Tom Petch's Speed, Aggression and Surprise both deal with the subject. They've joined me in previous episodes, so you can go back and listen to those if it piques your interest. And Gavin joined me earlier in the year to talk about the TV show SAS Rogue Heroes. Next week, I have a chat with Gordon Corrigan and Gary Sheffield on our Greatest British Commanders series as we take on Field Marshal Douglas Haig, Butcher Haig, or Hero of the Great War. Please do share with friends, it really helps the pod grow. This is my final episode before Christmas Day, so I'd like to wish all you listeners out there a Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year, and if that's not your sort of thing, thank you very much for listening anyway. I've really enjoyed firing these episodes out and happily seen the numbers increase, so from the bottom of my heart, thank you. You can get hold of me, I'm on the X, the Twitter, links are in the show notes. With that said, I'll hand you over to Gavin Mortimer, Tom Petch and myself on David Stirling and his role in the founding of the SAS. Gavin Mortimer, Tom Petch, welcome to welcome back to the pod. You're both you've both been on at least once before. It's a great pleasure to have you on, and I am having you both on because you've both previously joined to talk about the SAS in World War II, obviously, and then a little bit more exactly we've discussed the founding and the origins of the SAS. And as I was having a glass of something quite strong with Tom a few weeks ago, we were just sort of daydreaming, thinking, wouldn't it be great to have Gavin on with Tom to talk about the origins of the SAS? We're going to keep it nice and friendly because I know you're both hugely respectful of each other's work, both authors of really good books that came out. Tom's, your came out last year, I think, and Gavin earlier on last year in 2022. So I know that's me just going on a bit of a diatribe there, but if we kick off really, I wanted to start with, it's very murky, the beginning of the SAS. There doesn't seem to have been any kind of, I guess that helps with a lot of people's different views on how it all started. But I think it's fair to say, Gavin, if we start with you, you're a little bit clearer that there is one individual who has really not had as much. In fact, it's probably true of both of you. But Gavin, in your case, you think Bill Stirling hasn't had enough attention. And Tom, you probably think Dudley Clark hasn't had enough attention. So I thought, Gavin, if we start with you, is that a fair summary of your view?
Yeah, absolutely, it is. And when you say about murky, you're quite right. And it's very interesting. The first line of A Phantom Major, which is a book that, while I find entertaining in terms of accuracy, it's a sort of a 3 out of 10. But the first line in the acknowledgements of that, needless to say, the SAS did not keep detailed records of their operations in the Western Desert. I don't know why it's needless to say. That's superfluous. I mean, when Bill Stirling raised 2 SAS in May 43, they kept very detailed records. And in fact, it's interesting because L detachment, which was, as Tom will describe, was a brainchild of Dudley Clark, when that was raised in by as I put it, David and Bill Stirling in the summer of 41. The initial operations, they did keep detailed records. There's quite a lot of information by the survivors of the inaugural operation on the 16th, 17th of November, 1941. And similarly, Maine made a report on his raid in Thamet in December 1941. And then thereafter it stopped, when really David Stirling in the first 6 months of 1942, when David Stirling, as I put it, just went on these gallivanting operations, which achieved very little. They were wonderfully swashbuckling, but fairly incompetent. And so that allowed David Stirling in the Phantom Major to really rewrite the history. And it's interesting. Tom, I as you said, I disagree with Tom in that Dudley Clark had a great part in the SAS, other than the name and the sort of the deceptive quality to it. Bill, where I really agree with Tom is how Bill Fraser has been written out of it. That was David Stirling. He, of course, also wrote or diminished the role of the Long Range Desert Group, of Paddy Mayne, but particularly his brother, who's mentioned 4 times in the index in the Phantom Major. So that's right. It's the rewriting of the history of the SAS by David Stirling, 1958, which is very significant. That was 3 years after the death of Paddy Mayne. So he didn't touch the history of the SAS while Paddy Mayne was alive, but as soon as he was dead, that enabled Stirling to make out that it was really just him.
Well, I can see Tom is itching.
Yeah, we hit a lot of bases there, Gavin. I think you're in my 22 and going towards the try line in rugby. Right, yeah, okay, so maybe knock the Virginia Cowles thing first, right? So I don't buy, and this is something you have said, Gavin, I don't buy that Stirling waited for Paddy Mayne to die in order to tell the story of the SAS. And in fact, there's documentary evidence that Paddy Mayne and David Stirling were going to write a book together about the SAS, and that would have involved Paddy Mayne. He died before that book came into existence. And that book was sponsored by Carol Mather. I mean, you probably know this. I've got and basically Mather decided that because the record was so sketchy, that it was high time that they did something about it. So here we go. He basically said, it's high time we thought of putting together the record of all that happened in L Detachment, the SS Brigade in the desert between 1941 and 1943. And then he goes on, the book's got David's blessing, and we'll write the introduction and possibly one other chapter. Mrs. Stirling, so that's Bill Stirling's wife, would edit it. And the chapter suggestions are 1, Genesis, David Stirling; 2, Trips with the LRDG, Paddy Mayne; 3, Crete with George Jellicoe; 4 and 5, Benghazi raid, etc. And then Sandy Scratchley comes in at 7, George Alliston 8, and then the link up would be done by Mike Sadler. So this was like in the pipeline, and he even goes on to say that Paddy and David will decide at what point chapter 2 begins. So I think they were all working on it, and I do not buy this. And this is something where our sort of narrative really will differ. Is David and Paddy, I do not think, hated each other's guts. I think L Detachment was a highly dysfunctional organisation, a brilliant one, and there were very strong characters in it. And Jock Lewis and David Stirling talk about arguing quite a lot. And there are 2 very well documented bust-ups between Blair Paddy Mayne and David Stirling. But I don't think they hated each other's guts. And I think that the war record is, Virginia Cowles is not a patsy. She's a good war correspondent. It's just Paddy Mayne died before they got down the road of writing a book together.
Could it be then that Paddy Mayne dies very sadly in a car crash, and David Stirling then sees, okay, this is a bit of an opportunity?
But an opportunity for what? I mean, maybe that's
to inflate his.
Why would? Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Okay. If David Stirling's motivation is self-publicity, yes. If we accept that, I just don't accept that, because I think that David if you look back at David Stirling's history in the 20s, I think what he's about is pushing the narrative of the SAS. And let's not forget, the SAS is not a popular formation headquarters. It gets disbanded in 1945. It then has, and I'll be really honest with you, because we now go into the official secrets, it has trouble getting work constantly through its existence. The fact is that somebody has to keep it up front and centre in the minds of high command. And that person from 1940 was David Stirling, I think. Gavin probably doesn't agree with me, so you probably need to say something now, Gavin, about that's all nonsense, Tom, isn't it?
Well, firstly, that book you referred to, which I touch on in the collaborative history of the SAS, that was in 1950-51. And of course, the question is, why didn't it ever come to fruition? We don't know, but it may have been, it was very much, apart from Paddy Mayne, it was very much written by David Stirling's inner circle. But I think an important point to make is that in the Phantom Major, this is where this, in my opinion, and I know that Tom and I disagree with our view of Paddy Mayne, but interestingly, in 1946, David Stirling gave an interview to an American war correspondent who was writing a book about commando units. They weren't really called special forces back then. And when David Stirling talked, he said that he recruited Paddy Mayne from an infantry depot. And he also said that he got permission to raise this unit. He never mentioned, it was in the Phantom Major that two myths sprung up. The first, that Paddy Mayne was under close arrest when he was recruited into the SAS. I think everyone now really agrees that that wasn't the case, that he was indeed at a loose end, and that's how he was recruited into the SAS. And also this myth that David Stirling broke into Grey Pillars, the GHQ, while recovering from this very serious parachute accident in June 1941. And of course, we saw this in the BBC Rogue Heroes. As I say in the Phoney Major, Bill Stirling simply handed the document, the idea, to GHQ because Bill Stirling was working as the personal assistant to Lieutenant General Arthur Smith, who was Wavell's chief of staff. But of course, that's not really very glamorous. It's all a bit boring. So in the Phantom Major, David Stirling just began to create these myths that have been picked up. And because Paddy Mayne wasn't alive, and of course, Jock Lewis was killed in December 1941, and Bill Fraser, who Tom writes about very eloquently in his book, had ruined himself through drink and had a very tragic post-war life. There was no one really left to challenge David Stirling's version.
Yeah, my take is that Junior Cowles is a very good correspondent. You know, she writes a book at the start of the war. She works for the Chicago Sun in Cairo. She's not a patsy. She is an author. So she embellishes. You can say it's David Stirling making stuff up. That story about Grey Pillars, he does make that up. That's complete fantasy. Except that, and I knew there would be a record, and there is a record, of the first meeting between Neil Ritchie and Sir David Stirling. And the truth of it is he has got into the headquarters somehow. This is before he's broken his leg, because Neil Ritchie describes this meeting. These are on the cassettes of his record in the Imperial War Museum. And he describes this tall Scots Guards officer walking into his office, and he's never met him before. Now, that also trashes this idea that there was some sort of nepotism, that he'd been shooting with Neil Ritchie and all of that. That's not true. He got into the headquarters somehow. He pitches the parachute idea. And what's really interesting, at that point, Neil Ritchie's just taken over as head of operations, right? He's about to. He's in the same corridor as Arthur Tedder. And at that point, General Archibald Wavell is in command. And the two of them that morning have had a conversation about creating a parachute force. So Neil Ritchie obviously thinks this Scots Guards officer has something to do with it. He's nothing to do with it. He's somehow got in his office. So Neil Ritchie takes him down the corridor to meet Arthur Tedder, who's the RAF man, to talk about this parachute. And not until they get into Arthur Tedder's office does he say, "How the hell did you get in here?" And Stirling goes, "Oh, I made the sentry look the other way." And at that point, Neil Ritchie, and this is Neil Ritchie's record, and Neil Ritchie, there's a lot of faults with Neil Ritchie, but he doesn't make shit up. And he said, at that point, I thought this guy was quite useful, and I'd sponsor him. So that is a version which sort of backs actually Stirling's record there. I think Stirling's thing, again, going back to how he creates the SAS, is he exaggerates everything. He pretends they're parachuting when they're not. He exaggerates their raids. He exaggerates what happens. But again, that's to keep them in the mind of GHQ, with whom he's fighting to get the unit established.
Is that being quite kind to David Stirling? Because if you found any other officer commanding a detachment exaggerating their achievements, the senior officers would take quite a dim view, wouldn't they?
No, the senior officers don't. Okay, so I think I'm going to use an analogy, right? We're talking about a founder. So this is why I believe David Stirling is the founder of the SAS. The founder of, for example, Apple is Steve Jobs. The founder of Tesla is Elon Musk. The founder of Virgin is Richard Branson. Sometimes these people, if you take Steve Jobs, early days Apple, are not necessarily the type of people that you'd even want running an organization, but they're startup CEOs. And I put Stirling in that brain. He manipulates, he does a lot of things, but to be fair to him, and this is Jock Lewis saying this in a letter to his father, he says, I created the SAS from inside, so because Jock Lewis sets up the training for the SAS, and David Stirling set it up from the outside because he had to fight the corner with GHQ. And Jock Lewis says, of the two, fighting the corner with GHQ was the harder. And I think that's not a bad analogy. It's like, if you're a startup CEO, you got to go and get finance for your company. That's the harder job than building electric cars or Apple computers.
So then is it
just to come in on that, see the evidence I put forward in the Phoney Major is, for example, Charles Johnson, who was a diplomat in the British Embassy and shared a flat. Peter Stirling, who we haven't mentioned, was the third Stirling brother in Cairo in the summer of 1941, and he was a third secretary at the British Embassy. And they had a flat where the three Stirlings would often, when the three of them were in Cairo, it was a base really. And Charles Johnson stayed there, and there were some great parties by all accounts. But when he wrote his memoirs, he described them very much as both they'd acquired military fame in the Middle East as founders of a special air service. And he says that Bill and David had created a small irregular unit deploying all the weight of their private contacts to overcome the violent opposition of a military bureaucracy. And then Roy Farron, who's a great figure of 2SAS, the Paddy Mayne, if you like, of 2SAS, in his book Winged Dagger, which he wrote in 1947, he again says that Bill and David were the pioneers. So I think, and the joke was, as I say in the Phoney Major, that SAS stood in 1941-42 in North Africa. The joke was that SAS was Stirling and Stirling. And the SAS War Diary, published in 1946 and then re-released to the general public in 2011, says that, it very interestingly says that Bill describes Bill Stirling as the man from the shadows, but with his brother, he was in Cairo in 1941 and discussed the idea with his brother. Now, I agree with Tom that David very much had the personality. He was the front man, but Bill in GHQ was the brains behind it.
Yeah, see, I mean, I'm not going to dispute that Bill, and we can talk about, let's talk about Bill in a minute, because that's a specific subject.
Yeah, because you're a bit of a Bill skeptic. Would that be fair to say?
Okay, let's not get into Bill Stirling, because we have to deal with that in the round, and I'm very happy to talk about Bill Stirling. I will not deny Bill Stirling's in the flat. Undoubtedly, he talks to his brother, undoubtedly. However, if we're playing poker, Gavin, I'm going to lay three really big cards on the table. The first of which is the one that you referred to, which is the document that is in Karen Mather's file, which is called, I've got a second. Oh, wait, one caller. Here we go. It's the document that's titled Training of Parachute Troops, right? And that is signed by David Stirling, and it's undated, okay? But because it turns up in Mather's file and Jock Lewis's files, we got to assume that we know they were pitched, the idea, by David Stirling. We got that on record in my great-great-grandfather's hotel. Mather is pitched, he turns him down. Jock Lewis is pitched, he accepts, right? That's the first. There's no Bill Stirling in that, and neither of them mention Bill Stirling. And then the second, and I think this is key to maybe the difference between our narratives, is the 16th of July 41 document, which is in Clark's Beam file. So just quickly talk about Dudley Clark. At this point, there are fake parachutists, SS parachutists running around Cairo, two of them. Dudley Clark has created delusions in SAS. He's posed as an SAS colonel on a train to Palestine and dropped a letter on the Japanese spy, charge affairs. He's been to Palestine to set up the fake SAS base in Jordan. He's building fake gliders on Helwan airfield. He's building fake gliders, SS gliders on Fuqra airfield. and there are fake SAS parachutists dropping out of the air over Cairo. At which point, this turns up in his Abin file. And the point about the Abin file, this is the file for the fake SAS. And this is signed by David Stirling, 16th July 1941, case for retention of a few special service troops, which you'll have seen this document, Gavin, right? And then you cut to the first meeting of the SS, 27th of July 1941, held in the training branch of GHQ, attended by Dudley Clark and David Stirling. So I've got there's no Bill Stirling in that narrative. And my problem, I suppose, with the idea that he's actively involved in founding the SAS is I've worked in a few force headquarters. If he pitched the idea to Arthur Smith, and Arthur Smith took it seriously, why did Bill Stirling not write the document up and file it himself?
Well, Bill was returned to was summoned back to London on November the 3rd, 1941, 2 weeks before the inaugural operation. And I think an interesting question, Tom, to ponder is, and I'll put it to you, would you agree that after the failure of that inaugural operation, that there we see David Stirling was exposed because he didn't have the brains of Bill? And had it not been for what Bill Fraser and Paddy Mayne achieved between them in December 1941, when they, with their teams, they destroyed about 100 aircraft, that the SAS would probably have folded, and that Stirling was really floundering in the winter of 41, 42. And he, obviously, they never had another parachute operation. And as I referred to earlier, he just went on these poorly planned operations to Borat, to Benghazi. And it was only when they got the Jeeps in June 1942 that they began to fulfill their potential, if you like. So I think that, again, it consolidates my view that Bill Stirling was the brains. And there's two quotes I mentioned from GHQ staff officers in the Phoney Major. One saying, "We all know Stirling's weakness, David Stirling's, for laying on his plans by the queerest methods. His ideas of organisation are elementary, to say the least." That was in December 1941. And the reply was, "I found that his natural impetuousness and importunity make it difficult for him to stick to any procedure." So this is what I say. We haven't mentioned the LRDG's role either. My view is that Stirling was physically very brave. He was an ideas man, but he wasn't very competent. And without his brother beside him, and then when Jock Lewis was killed in December 1941, he was really lost. And he turned the SAS into, he recruited the likes of Fitzroy MacLean and Randolph Churchill, who really weren't suited to this sort of warfare. And for the first 6 months of 1942, as Guy Prendergast, the CEO of the LRDG, described it, it was like something out of Gilbert and Sullivan. Some of these, I think very daring raids, but useless.
Okay. So my take on this is that David Stirling, what he's really, really good at, and I'm going to go on using this, he iterates, right? So after the first operation, he iterates. Him and Jock Lewis have that discussion to use the LRDG. And the reason they use the LRDG is because he's got drunk at Shepherds with Prendergast. Now, the LRDG and the SAS fall out later on because basically L Detachment SAS is hopelessly disorganized. Now, we can talk about that. I think the tragedy is that what Stirling was good at was filling his capability gaps. From founding the unit, he knew he was a disorganized guy, right? But there are lots of disorganized guys. I mean, famously, Richard Branson didn't know the difference between net and gross profit when he was running Virgin Airlines age 50. You can fill a capability gap. But what Stirling was doing was iterating. So the first one went wrong, then they iterated. And you're right. But the CEO of a unit does not have to he doesn't have to fly a 747 or make computers or make a Tesla car. He has to be able to get people who can do that. And Fraser and Mayne, you're absolutely right, were brilliant operators. But they didn't found the unit. They are founders, but they didn't found it. He's found it. And it's really interesting. I'm just going to finish on this thing about this. So you cited it was this bit about the middle management of GHQ constantly blocking him, which they do. So that quote you read is, and I saw this as well. We all know Stirling's weakness for laying on plans by the queerest methods. So Stirling at this point has got hold of a Wellington bomber, presumably through Peter Oldfield, who's a guy who works in GHQ, and they block it, right? But this is in December 1941. So why, and I'll ask both of you, this is an SS question, Why would Stirling want a Wellington bomber in December 1941? It's a specific airframe. It's not a Bombay, not a Whitley, not a Bristol, a Wellington bomber. Why?
Well, if you were asking me, and I know next to all about Wellington bombers, is it so you can jump out of it?
He can jump out of a Bombay. Why a Wellington? I'm just asking the question. Come on, Gavin. This is like it's an SAS insertion question. Why? Let's situate it a bit. At that moment, they're trying to get on airfields and destroy them. They're parachuting. That hasn't gone wrong. They're going in with the LRGG, and Fraser is going in on foot. But why? What would be useful about a Wellington bomber? I'll give you a clue. Dudley Clark uses a Wellington bomber because it looks a bit like a Heinkel 111 at night.
Oh, so you can go behind.
You're trying to land on an enemy. You're trying to land on an enemy airfield.
Absolutely. That's why I think I think that's why he asked for a Wellington. He thinks he can get an SS team in it and land it on an airfield. Now, I can't prove that, but GHQ don't give him the aircraft. They block it. But my argument would be it's a Wellington bomber. Give him the bloody bomber. The SS are behind enemy lines. They're destroying airfields, and they want a Wellington bomber. It's one airframe with a crew of what? 2 or 3. This is the thing. He's constantly iterating and fighting against this resistance. And that's why I think he is a genius. Yeah.
David Stirling is the genius here.
Yeah, I do think that. I think there's a difference between the sort of theory side of things. And I think Bill Stirling had that, because the place where I'll completely agree with Gavin is the early days with the Lock training wing and the early commandos. Bill Stirling is the initiator of that. He's a great training officer. But there's a difference between a great training officer and someone's going to go on the front line, iterate to make this shit happen.
Okay, so if we shift it slightly to the early days and the role of Dudley Clark, Gavin, I think you said earlier that Dudley Clark comes up with a name and a few other things. I mean, the name Special Air Service, I think Tom would argue that Dudley Clark had a sort of larger role, but the name itself, I mean, that was a stroke of genius, wasn't it? Special Air Service.
Yeah, no, I mean, he was great at deceptive warfare, and but I don't think he's mentioned just once briefly in the Phantom Major, and then Alan Ho's authorised biography of Stirling, which was written 30 years ago. He's just mentioned briefly there for coming up with the name, which Stirling said, I think he quipped, does the L stand for learner? But I don't think that, as Tom writes in his book, Dudley Clark was actually from about August the 16th. He left Cairo for Europe and didn't return until after the inaugural raid. And so I disagree with Tom that Dudley Clark had any more influence than coming up with the name.
Clark did, and Stirling credits him, I think he really did help him get it off the ground with GHQ and with recruitment, because I think Dudley Clark got them in with 11 Commando, which ultimately led to the recruitment of Ian McGonigal Fraser, because when Stirling goes and does his song and dance down at Cabrit to recruit people, because he's struggling, I think Clark helps him there, and Stirling kind of credits him with that. But I don't say that Dudley Clark's the founder. The reason I write a lot about Dudley Clark and the backstory of Special Forces is I'm trying to show what's unique about Special Forces is their strategic role. You know, a regular unit, and this is the difference between the SAS and everything that's gone before, except the very early commandos, that's Clark's commando, is it works for the force commander. So you constantly have this. So if you're in a regular unit, you've got 7 layers of command. David Stone reports direct to the force commander. And that's the point about all these sort of middle management bust-ups, which he calls the fossilized shit, is that, I mean, we're in official secrets kind of, but let's just use the Second World War. If he wants a Wellington bomber, if he wants a G, he should get it because the force commander will give it to him. And that was actually established with the LRGG by Ralph Bagnold and Wavell. Wavell was the guy who sponsored that and said, yeah, you go do it. You're reporting directly to me. You don't report to any of this middle management.
Going back to David Stirling a bit, one thing that I was quite persuaded by, Gavin, is your argument that he's, and I think this is something you'd both agree on, that he's a great salesman. He's fantastic at, I guess, the Wellington bomber example accepted, at really arguing with the senior command about what the SAS is doing and how important it is. Is that something, Tom, then, that is perhaps his gift at being a front man?
I think nobody's going to argue that Blair Paddy Mayne or William Fraser are far better operators than David Stirling in the desert. Nobody's going to argue that. But that's not his role. Where he's brilliant and where's his genius is keeping them going, keeping them supported. And that is a constant fight. And we'll talk about this because I was quite interested, Gavin, this letter where Blair Paddy Mayne writes to Bill Stirling. This is after David's captured, saying, I wish David was here, because the disaster for the SAS, I think, this is my opinion, is David Stirling's capture and then the unraveling. It gives GHQ the opportunity to dismantle the SAS, which is what they've wanted to do for a very long time. And this guy, Cater, that they wanted to put in command of the SAS, he now gets the gig because Stirling isn't there. But if you go back even just a few months, the Auchinleck, who was then in command, is arguing for David Stirling. You can see it written all over the transcripts. Where's David Stirling in this mob? Because they're reorganizing all the special forces. And he thinks David Stirling should be in charge, and he calls him up to a meeting in the desert. And basically, they agree that they're going to have this 4-squadron SS regiment, which would have been brilliant around the time of El Alamein. Instead of which we have, Mayne and Fraser operating with just one squadron out in front. That's it.
I mean, I think that's we must touch on Stirling's conduct after so L Detachment was granted regimental status at the end of September 1942, expanded very quickly. And it's very interesting, as I detail in the Phoney Major, that as Tom has just referred to, Mayne and Fraser went up with A Squadron behind the lines in Libya and harassed the Germans as they began to pull back after the El Alamein offensive. Stirling spent much of November in hospital. And when he came out, he took B Squadron up into the desert to launch operations. Now, this was against the express orders of GHQ, who said he was not to go on operations. Sean Hackett, who was in command of what was known then as Desert Raiding Forces, the signals which I detail in the Phoney Major were saying, where are you? What are you doing? And of course, he then got himself captured. Now, Tom's absolutely right. That threw the SAS, well, it exposed them. It made them vulnerable. And he had, I'll be interested to hear what Tom thinks of Stirling's capture. But to me, it's the height of irresponsibility. And there's a quote from Brigadier George Davey, who was Director of Military Operations, who said that when Stirling told him the route he was going to take, he was captured in Tunisia. He said, no, you're going far too close to the enemy. You need to change your route. But as Davey said, in his typical arrogant way, he ignored me. And so I think that is, again, another example of the irresponsibility and the arrogance of David Stirling that really did endanger his regiment. And it was because of Bill Stirling, who was then posted to, he was taken out, by this time he was in CO of number 62 Commando, which would become 2 SAS. And he was sent to Cabrit by Laycock, Combined Operations, to really see what was going on and make recommendations, etc. And so it was a time of real chaos, and that was because of David Stirling.
Yeah, I definitely. Sorry, Tom. I definitely did want to ask about the capture, because it is. I mean, I remember reading in your book, Gavin, about the capture. As you just mentioned, you're pretty damning of it. Tom, what's your view on the capture of David Stirling?
Absolutely, no doubt, he was absolutely pushing his luck, and you can say, but I mean, why was he going there? Why did he push his luck? And my feeling is because him and Sean Hackett had a massive bust up with Monty, this well documented. So that's General Montgomery, because they needed troops. And one of the things that went wrong with B Squadron, Gavin, was they couldn't get any troops. They had raw recruits who were inexperienced. It's why the whole operation was a cock-up, right? And I think Stirling was pushing his luck to prove to 8th Army and to GHQ that they could do this job, right? They couldn't. They didn't have the resources. They didn't even have the fuel. Montgomery and 8th Army had not supported them with enough equipment and fuel to even get out there. As Montgomery said, he said, once I reach, I will have no further use for your unit. So they're fighting a battle that is a publicity battle to keep the regiment in operation. And that's what I feel happened. I think it is a tragedy. We've both interviewed Mike Sadler. but that's the point, really, is that Mike Sadler was with them. He didn't see this as a bad thing to do, you know. I mean, they all loved David Sterling. That's the other thing I say. All his troops loved him, which is a bit indicative. If you've got a commanding officer that's loved by his men, I generally think that means he's a good bloke.
I disagree that he was loved by his men. I mean, I interviewed several L Detachment veterans, and they spoke quite dispassionately of David Sterling, whereas Paddy Mayne, they had much more reverence for.
Well, yeah. Well, should we move on? Let's talk a bit about Bill Sterling, because I think that let me just start with this, Gav. So the narrative of Bill Sterling, and this is where I think that I disagree with you. Bill Sterling never goes into combat during the entire Second World War. Am I correct?
He did go on Operation Knife in April 1940 to Norway with 5 other people from MIR, which was the forerunner of the Special Operations Executive. But en route, they were to land on Norway and then work with the Norwegian partisans in blowing up German lines of communications. But unfortunately, en route to Norway, their submarine hit a surface mine, so they had to return to Rosyth. And it was there, actually, that Bill Sterling said they were told initially that there was going to be 2 or 3 days before they got a replacement submarine. So he said, well, let's come back to the estate at Keir, which is just outside Bridge of Allen in central Scotland, and we'll wait until we have a new submarine. And it was there that, as Peter Kemp, who was one of the 6 men, who was one of the great irregular warfare exponents of the Second World War, as he wrote, that it was there that Bill Sterling said, listen, so far this has been a joke. We know nothing about guerrilla warfare. We need to set up an establishment where we can learn, where we can train. And of course, this coincided. We're talking now beginning of May 1940. That the establishment was the Special Training Centre, which was established at Loch Islet in June 1940. Fortunate timing, because of course Winston Churchill replaced Chamberlain as PM in May 1940. He was a great fan of irregular warfare and was the driving force behind the commandos. But no, to answer your question, then he didn't actually see combat in World War II.
No, but I think so. That's interesting, because I completely agree with that. And Lord Lovett, says the same thing. Bill Sterling creates this idea, which I would argue then segues with, because the guy who creates MO9 is Dudley Clark. So then people like David Niven pitch up at the training. But then there's this weird thing where, so Bill Sterling he's the chief instructor at that point. Brian Mayfield commands. Yeah, that's right, isn't it? So then there's this thing where you've got all the commandos, 7, 8, 11. They're all going to set sail to the Mediterranean to bust up the Italian coastline. Churchill wants them to go down there. And you've got, so MIR, which you referred to, Peter Fleming works there, and he gets this Operation Yak gig, which is basically, it's a bit complicated, but this is a job that Peter Fleming, who is working for military intelligence, is given to go out to North Africa to convert Italian prisoners of war into British soldiers, to create a Garibaldi battalion that can then fight for us. So those are battalions. And he recruits a team. He goes up for 3 days at the Lockalock training wing. And then presumably he bumps into Bill Sterling, because then on the 21st, Jan, in your book, Bill Sterling's posted to the Yak mission. And they all set out. So that's all the commandos, all the special forces guys, they all set out for North Africa. But Peter Fleming and Bill Sterling get to Freetown, realise they're going to go around the Cape. So they then fly to Cairo. Right, and then Bill Sterling drops out of that mission. So why is that happen? What's going on there? Because I'm confused by that.
Well, the Yak mission was a failure because they didn't realise that the Italians were very happy at being POWs and didn't want to fight anymore. So that's so that's perfectly described, Tom. And then to pick that up, so the Yak mission failed fairly quickly. They realised the Italians just weren't up for it. They quite enjoyed lounging in the sun in North Africa. So Bill, though, was still employed at SOE. Now, there's a big SOE was very it was a incipient organisation, very badly structured at this time, and there was also there began to be a turf war between GHQ and SOE, sort of encroachment on territory. Bill Sterling began to actually smuggle documents out with the help of
Hermione Ranfurly did
exactly with under a bra.
Sorry, can I just pause you there, because I want to focus on the Yak mission, right? Because this is going to question Bill Sterling's war record, is why I'm doing this. So Peter Fleming sends a signal to London going, Bill Stirling or William Stirling has dropped out of the mission, but it'll make no difference to the mission. And at this point, they have been tasked with an operation. They've got to go to Greece to carry out guerrilla warfare. So Peter Fleming goes to Greece without Bill Stirling, and it's a nightmare. They end up with the Aussies trying to supply them with explosives. They drive an ammunition train up to the front line, nearly get killed. They go back down to Athens, blow the coast road. And then finally, they're tasked with evacuating the embassy. So Peter Fleming and his team provide the machine gunners on this militarized yacht, getting out the family and children of the embassy. They don't make it very far. They get to an island, at which point Peter Fleming gets them off because the German dive bombers come in, and they blow the shit out of them. They kill one of Peter Fleming's best friends. He gets injured and evacuated. And then they go back to Cairo, which I think has got to make an awkward moment on the Shepherd's Bar when Peter Fleming orders a John Collins, and Bill Stirling has basically not gone on this operation. Even though Peter Fleming's the commander, and he should have gone, in my opinion, he hasn't gone.
Well, my take on that is he actually returned to the Scots Guards for a while, who by now are in the desert. Brian Mayfield, who you mentioned earlier, who was a commandant at Loch Islet, he was out in North Africa too now with the Scots Guards. So he returned to the Scots Guards, and in fact, as I describe in the Phoney Major, there was a fourth Stirling brother. So there were 6 Stirlings in total, 2 sisters, 4 brothers. Hugh, the youngest, went missing in action while attached to the Durham Light Infantry in April 1941. Bill went up to the lines to look for him and couldn't find him, and it was at that point. So my take on that is that Bill Stirling, who had very high standards, and don't forget, had been groomed to command from an early age, because as the eldest of the 6, and this is something to, again, just sort of an important aside, is that the Stirlings were very wealthy, very well connected, and very aristocratic. So the mum, Margaret, was one of the socialites of that sort of the Belle Epoque, if you like. And so that undoubtedly helped both Bill and David.
We're running out of time.
Just to finish that. So Bill got out to Cairo, saw really that yet again, the SOE, who at this point in the war recruited on A, which school you went to, and B, if you worked in the city. So there were some superbly incompetent people. Bill didn't like incompetence. So he left SOE, got himself a job in GHQ, working, as I said at the start, as a personal assistant to Lieutenant General Arthur Smith, the Chief of Staff. And so it was at the very heart of the war in North Africa.
Well, okay, but I'm just going to. Okay, we're going to run out of time, aren't we? But
we are. But carry on quickly.
I want to drill down into the war, because there's a very strange signal this time that goes from GHQ to London, going. Bill Stirling says he's got a place at Staff College. Is this true? Or it goes, can you please confirm? Now, Bill Stirling, to my knowledge, does not attend Staff College. So Staff College is the senior training stuff. So you're right. It's what you do if you're going to become a commanding officer in normal times, right? You have to pass your Staff College exams, be nominated, and about 6 months out, you'd know you were going to Staff College. So Peter Fleming would have known, GHQ would have known, Scots Guards would have known. So what's that signal about? Because I think it sounds like maybe he's lying, because there's no record of him going to Staff College or having a place at Staff College.
When was that signal sent?
It's sent. I'll tell you what, I can probably supply all this. We don't know, but it's in his war record straight after the Fleming signal.
Yeah, no, I mean, it may well have been, because, of course, he was summoned back when the War Office discovered that in late October 1941 that because he didn't tell them, Bill Stirling. And I think this is indicative of the Stirlings.
He didn't tell them.
That's very much the Stirlings' modus operandi. They do as they please. Both brothers. Oh, absolutely, both brothers.
Okay, so I'm going to just, because I know we're going to run out of time, Gavin, so I want to go through this. So he then goes SSRS, and he doesn't go on any operations across the channel. Doesn't go on any operations across the channel, right? Yeah. Then he comes out, 6-2 Commando, we come back out to Africa, and this is the run into SAS, yeah? And this is where, so there are a lot of operations. In fact, one of the officers at Appleyard, you say he has a mental breakdown because he's on so many operations.
Not a mental breakdown. He's just sort of worn out. So Bill Stirling
combat stress. Let's call it combat stress. He has some sort of break. One of his officers has a breakdown, and then we're into 2 SAS, and then 2 SAS go to Italy. Where does Bill? And so he's now commanding officer of a regiment, 4 squadrons that deploy to Italy. Where does Bill Stirling go?
Well, in September 1943, he returns to London, and that he begins to plan for the expansion of the SAS into a brigade. And I think he'd hoped to lead that, to lead the SAS brigade, which I think
he doesn't. Okay, I'm just going. He doesn't go to Italy. He doesn't go to Italy. When does he come back?
So he comes back. He goes. So initially, 2 SAS raised May 1943. Then that's in Algiers is where they're based. And their first operations are in various islands, Lampedusa, for example, in May, June 1943. The first significant operation is Operation Chestnut in July 1943 in Sicily, and then there's various operations in.
But I'm going to be really.
We are running out of time.
I'm just going to say this. So you've got a commanding officer of an SAS regiment with 4 squadrons in the field. In combat, and he goes to England. And in fact, he doesn't return till January. And when he returns, there's a mutiny in the regiment. They want to get rid of him.
Oh, no. That's there's a mutiny among a certain section of upper class officers.
All the officers.
Roy Farron describes them as half-assed fighting types.
Okay. I'm going to pick you up on that because one of those.
I think look. I'm going to have to dive in because Gavin has a very nice Burgundian
we're in
lunch.
The middle of the field. Come on, I've got a drop coming up.
He has a very good lunch waiting for him, and I think he's been told he has to go in 1 minute. I mean, I only wish we had Ridley Scott here to witness this debate between 2 historians.
Can I just make a very quick final point? What we didn't talk and what I thought was wonderful about Tom's book is paying tribute to Bill Fraser, who has been really overlooked, and we saw that in BBC Rogue Heroes. I think he flits in and out very briefly, but he was an extraordinary SAS soldier, and of course I think no other SAS officer saw as much active service as Bill Fraser in World War II, including Paddy Mayne, and he's been overlooked by history. So it's great that Tom and me, to a lesser extent, are sort of shining a light on Bill Fraser.
Oh, well, that's nice. A rare moment of agreement.
Listen, we agree on some things. I think I would like a rematch on the Bill Stirling story, though. I'm not convinced by Bill Stirling, but I think and Gavin, you're an excellent historian, thorough research. But I think the nuance of Bill Stirling is that, in my opinion, if you're a CO of a combat unit, you've got to go into combat. You cannot command a regiment. If that's actually just a rule. That's just a rule now.
Was Tony Greville Bell, who was a 2 SAS officer and one of the original 2 SAS officers, and then served in Malaya with 2 SAS. He told me that he described the difference between Bill and David, and said David was very much the younger brother, the more physical kind, and Bill was more cerebral. And that he said, yes, he never went in operations, but as in his view, Tony Greville Bell's, that was the right thing to do. But I suggest a rematch, Tom.
Yeah,
at the time
we've got as far as 43
to coincide with D-Day, Ollie, because of course Bill Stirling, that's when he had his great.
Got all that to
great
come
stuff.
In
well, okay, so let's speak before June next year, and I'm going to put in a little picture of us doing this chat.
Yes.
Okay. But thanks so much. Both your books, Gavin, new book out, and Tom's book, we all know.
Thanks so much for listening. Please do share. Greatest British Commanders next week, and plenty more episodes to come, including Adam Zamoyski's take on the film Napoleon. Until then, thank you, and good night.